And I'd like to introduce, this is Hillary. I'd like to introduce you all to Anusha Segal. She is your teacher for the night. She's going to be introducing you to the subdoshas and a little bit of review. And she will be your teacher for the weekend along with Kate. So you get to be introduced to her on the screen first. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Anusha. And I'll come back on. I'm recording this for others. So enjoy. All yours, Anusha.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm so glad to virtually meet you, and we'll be meeting in person very soon. So today we will be discussing the subdoshas, which is sort of the different types of each and every dosha. And what the subdoshas really represent is the dosha, but it's different functions. Depending on the functions that it carries out in the body, it has a different name or a term. Ideally, what we need to remember is when we talk about subdoshas that they are not exclusive to each other. It's actually, for instance, Vata has 5 types, and Pitta has 5 types, and Kapha has 5 types. But all 5 types of Vata is still one and the same Vata. Depending on the Vata moving around or having different functions, it gets a different name, but it is still the one and same Vata. Okay? Similarly, Pitta, it's still Pitta, but it carries out specific functions in certain parts of the body, so therefore it has 5 different names. Okay, so I'm just going to share with you some slides that I have, and we're just going to do a quick review of what the doshas, the elemental composition of these doshas, and also the qualities that are associated with it. So that'll give you a better idea as to why we have these subdoshas and how they actually carry out their function, and how do we understand that these things do actually exist. Okay, we may not be able to finish all of the subdoshas today, but that's okay because we have left time to continue it on in another class as well. So we're going to try to get through as much of the subdoshas as we can today. Okay, so I'm just going to switch over to my screen so you'll be able to see. Okay. There you go. So in Ayurveda, we know that the doshas are basically a representation of the 5 elements that we know exist in the body, and the same 5 elements that exist in the universe. They say that all matter, everything that has a physical form, is made out of all 5 elements, and that is equivalent to that which we can find in our external universe, and also those same 5 elements are responsible for the makeup of our body. So how do we understand the existence of these 5 elements in the body and what they actually do? We understand them by these 3 doshas, and these 3 doshas represent the different functions or the different physiological as well as anatomical structures that these 5 elements actually attribute to in the body. Okay? So this is one of the most basic fundamental concepts that we follow in Ayurveda. And when we look at different disorders, we look at different imbalances, everything can always be traced back to these 5 elements. Okay? So the 5 elements in the body, we've learned this earlier, is that there's akasha or space, also ether, air or vayu, fire or agni, up or jala, both are Sanskrit terms that are used for water, and prithvi or earth. Okay, and vata is a combination of space and air. Pitta is a combination of fire and water, and kapha is a combination of water and earth. Okay, the reason why we have it in this particular order from space going all the way down to earth is because in the course of evolution, which you have gone over in the fundamental philosophical aspects of Ayurveda, we know that in evolution, these elements actually come into existence in this particular order. It goes from the most subtle to the most gross. So similarly, we find the same sort of qualities that are associated with these elements. We find them associated with the doshas that is made out of those particular elements. Okay, so just a brief description. Ether is space. In order for something to exist, it needs to have a substratum, or it needs to be able to occupy a space. So space is the most basic element that is necessary in order for you to have a tangible matter, or in order for something to exist. Once that space, once there is movement or generation of energy, or there is something that is transforming, that movement in energy is nothing but the vayu, or the air, because air is attributed to movement. Okay, so the movement, or the exchange of the energies that is available in that space, is where air starts to be formed. Okay, so from that air, when there is movement and there's generation of energy, then that also creates and produces friction. And friction is nothing but the representation of heat, fire. So that's how we end up getting the fire element. From this fire and this heat that is generated, when it condenses, it turns into water. And so that's how we have the water element. And the most grossest element of all, which is earth, is a combination of all these other elements put together. That's how we have the earth element. So in looking at this particular evolution of the elements from the most subtle to the most gross, we can also understand why we have certain qualities that are associated with Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Vata being the most subtle of the doshas, and Kapha being the most gross and the most stable of the three doshas. Okay? So what are the qualities that are associated with Vata? And this again is just a review, because I know you guys have already actually gone through this. So Vata, remember, the body is always made up of 5 elements. It's never exclusive, or we can't say it's only these particular 2 elements. Even in Vata, even in Pitta, even in Kapha, you do actually have all 5 of the elements, but they are in very tiny, minute forms. So the functions that are carried out in the body by space and air is represented by the functions of Vata. So Vata is predominantly space and air. So therefore, the qualities, or the gunas that are associated with that, are Ruksha, which is dry, Laghu, which is light, Shita, which is cold, Kara, which is rough, Sukshma, which is small or minute, and Chala, which is movement. So if you look, for instance, if you look at all 5 of these elements, and you look at these particular qualities, these qualities match up closely to that of what we would think of as space and air. You wouldn't necessarily think of small and minute associated with the earth element, or you wouldn't necessarily think of cold associated with the fire element. Cold is partially associated with the water element, but it's more cold to touch and not necessarily the actual generation of cold, the cold feeling. So, for instance, you have breeze that is also cold, and you have water also that can be cold. Okay? So, the Shita quality is associated with that of Vata. Okay? This is just, again, a very quick review. So, therefore, now we understand that we look at the actual functions of Vata. Okay, so we looked at the qualities, but these qualities can be associated in different parts of the body. So how do we know that the Vata is actually carrying out certain functions, or the space and air element in the body is carrying out certain functions? By looking at these 5 subdoshas of Vata. So the 5 subdoshas of Vata are Prana, Udana, Samana, Apana, and Vyana. Okay? So Prana is the first of the subdoshas. It's the first subdosha of Vata. It is the most important of the subdoshas of Vata. Prana actually represents not only the exchange of air. Basically, it is breathing. It's responsible for breathing and and for exchange of energy. But remember, prana also here, it has two terms or two meanings. There's prana, which is sort of the life force, and that life force exists in every matter that is there in existence. So for instance, in Ayurveda, we accept that everything has a consciousness and everything has a life force, whether it is animate or inanimate, whether it is apparent that it has a life force or it's not apparent that it has a life force. So for instance, there may be an argument that says rocks do not have life. However, we know that rocks have a certain energy that they give off. That's why they use different gems for certain types of therapies. So even the rocks that are inanimate, they don't necessarily give off the appearance of having life, do actually still have a certain life to it. They have a certain energy to it. And that energy is nothing but the prana. Okay, so the prana, what we look at here is there's prana, or the life force that exists within us, and then there's also the prana that exists within everything that is in our environment. And when we breathe, when there's an exchange of air, we are actually taking in the prana from the external and releasing the used up prana from ourselves. So that is kind of like the exchange of the different gases when we're inhaling and exhaling. Okay, but prana is basically the exchange of the life force. That's why, for instance, there's different qualities of prana. For instance, if you go up to a mountainous region and you take a really deep breath, when you take that deep breath in, you feel like you're alive. It's because that is very pure or very fresh air or very pure prana. So when you inhale that, you automatically start to feel that energy within you because you have actually taken in that pure prana and it has added to your prana. Okay? So that exchange of breathing, or that constant flow of prana, is nothing but, again, the prana vata. Okay? So this prana vata is located, basically, the locations of where it carries out its function is in the head, the brain, the chest, and the throat. And its function is, again, breathing, sneezing, controlling of thoughts, swallowing, and intelligence. So you would think, again, here, okay, breathing and sneezing makes sense, and even swallowing. But how does thoughts and intelligence have anything to do with prana? Because the reason we say that is because vata is known for movement, right? This is one of the basic qualities of vata. The most important quality of vata is the fact that vata moves. If we look at all of the other doshas, they actually do not move. Where they are located in the body, and we are going to look at the different functions in the body. The other doshas are actually stagnant. And the only way they are able to carry out their function is because of the initiation that is done by vata. Vata is responsible for pushing or actually moving or initiating the other doshas to carry out their functions. So you can say, I always use this example of vata kind of being like a manager in a factory. So you have all of these different workers in the factory, and they all have certain duties and they all have certain responsibilities. But until their manager doesn't show up and tell them, okay, you need to get to work, they won't actually do their work. So vata has that role of the manager. Vata is the one that initiates and sort of pushes the other doshas to carry out their functions and to do their work. Okay, so in saying that, vata also is responsible for the flow and the movement of thoughts and being able to understand our thoughts. Similarly with intelligence, because if we look at the nervous system, isn't that also a transference of certain energies and transference of different perceptions from one place to the next? So because of, again, that transference or that movement, that is nothing but, again, carried out by vata. So vata is really important and necessary for us to be able to understand, or for that cognitive function. And that is done by the prana vata. So In all types of vata, as I mentioned, the cardinal quality of vata is movement. So therefore, all the five types of vata will have a certain type of movement, because they're all actually one and the same vata, but depending on which direction or where it is moving or flowing, it carries out a different function. And the function itself is also movement. If you look at all of these functions are actually some form of movement. So depending on the flow or the movement of the vata, it carries out a function of movement, and therefore it has a different name. Okay? So the flow or the movement of the prana vata is downwards and inwards. So for instance, when we're inhaling, that it moves inwards and downwards. Okay, so that is the actual natural flow, or gati. Gati means flow or movement of the prana vata. The next subdosha of vata is udana vata. Okay, the udana vata is that which is located in the diaphragm and the throat. And it is, again, the movement or the air that comes up and that produces the function of speech, expression, voice, memory, enthusiasm, and complexion. So we can understand, again, in order to be able to produce sound, you actually need to have some air that passes through your throat, that passes through your vocal cords, that vibrates and that produces that sound or produces your voice or speech. Okay, so that movement of that air that goes upwards and that regulation of that movement of air is nothing but the udana vata. Okay, it's also responsible for enthusiasm. Again, enthusiasm is something that is, again, initiated. It's, again, another type of movement. You ever notice that if someone is enthusiastic or they're excited, they move, they tend to either gyrate, or they're excited and there's a constant movement. Okay, so that's, again, done by the udana vata. When someone is calm, you wouldn't necessarily see that movement. But in excitement, you see that movement. Because in excitement, it's, again, a function of the udana vata. So therefore, there will be some form of movement. And color and complexion. So here, the reason why it's for color and complexion is because actually all three of the doshas have a part to play in the different types of complexion. So when you, for instance, when you guys go through and look at the different body types, you're going to notice that they talk about different types of complexion. Not necessarily the color of the skin, but the actual glow and the complexion of your skin. So for instance, whether the person is Caucasian or whether they have dark skin or they have brown skin, there is different tones to your skin. So for instance, if someone hasn't slept all night, you ever notice that they get the dark circles under their eyes? So that dark circle is nothing but, again, the expression of too much of this type of vata that is causing the darkening of the dark circles underneath the eyes. Okay, so that, again, is done by that function is carried out by the udana vata. The regulation of the amount of complexion or color that comes out in certain parts of the face or certain parts of the body is done by the udana vata. And the flow of udana vata is upwards. In looking at speech, of course, it starts at the diaphragm and it goes up, and that's how it produces sound. So therefore, the flow is upwards. The next is samana vata. And samana vata is one of the very important functions of vata. In fact, all of these are important, but samana vata is extremely important when it comes to digestion, because the samana vata is located in the stomach, the small intestine, and near the umbilicus or the navel. And what the samana vata does, it is responsible for igniting the agni. So I'm not sure if you guys have had a chance to go over agni, but when we talk about agni here, we're actually talking about the digestive fire. So there is a concept in Ayurveda that looks at that metabolism and digestion is actually done by a thing called the digestive fire. And that's not necessarily the functions of the stomach. It's not necessarily just the functions of the enzymes, but it's the actual Agni, the process of being able to break down food that you have ingested. That is done by the Agni. And here, whenever we use that term as
Thank you for
another webinar.
In reference to
Another webinar.
Oh, okay.
whenever we use the term Agni in reference to digestion, it always means the term Jatar Agni. So Jatar Agni means Jatara is the term used for the stomach, and Agni is the fire. So the fire that is located in the stomach is known as the digestive fire is known as the Jatar Agni. Okay, and this Jatar Agni, which is the major component that is responsible for digestion or for proper breakdown of your food, is ignited by the Samanavata. So again, you may ask, what does that really mean, that the Samanavata is igniting the Agni? So you've ever seen a campfire where you have these pieces of wood, and you light the campfire, and on top of the campfire you'll put whatever it is that you want to cook or whatever it is you're trying to heat up, right? So how do you regulate the intensity of the fire in the campfire? You blow on it. If you blow on the fire, the actual flames become more intense. And if you don't blow on it, it'll go up, and then it'll start to die back down again. So that blowing action, or the bellows, that actually transference of air that ignites or that regulates the intensity of the Agni is nothing but the Samanavata. The Samanavata does the exact same action in the body of igniting the Agni, the Jatar Agni, in your stomach, igniting your appetite or your hunger, and regulating that. So for instance, why some people feel hungry 3 times a day. You've ever noticed some people are there who have a great appetite, and their hunger is like clockwork. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, they need to have breakfast. They're hungry. Exactly at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, they're hungry for lunch. And exactly at 6 and 6:30, they're ready for dinner. And their body works like clockwork. That's because their Samanavata is also working it's doing its job in a very regulated manner. And that's why the person feels hungry. It ignites the Agni exactly at that time. And when you pass that time, then it goes away again. It doesn't ignite it before, it doesn't ignite it after, but it ignites it exactly at that time. So how do you feel hungry at that time? It's because of, again, the Samanavata. Okay, so the major function of it, apart from just igniting the Agni, it helps for secretion of digestive enzymes, again, for basically responsible for regulating a person's appetite, and for holding of proper time of, that was for the next one. So secretion of digestive enzymes and for the appetite. And the flow or the movement of this type of Samanavata is linear, okay? So the next type of Vata is Apanavata. And the Apanavata is that which is located in the colon and the pelvic cavity. It is responsible for holding of proper timing and the elimination of feces, urine, semen, menstruation, and of the fetus or the baby. Okay? And its gati or flow is downward. The Apanavata is another very important concept that we look at here in Ayurveda, in again, the digestive tract and how there is proper elimination of waste. So one thing that we always joke about in Ayurveda, that we pay so much attention to someone's poop, and we're constantly talking about it and constantly asking about it. But there is a reason why we always ask about that, because the waste product that is happening, that is the end result of digestion, really reflects and gives us an idea as to how the digestive process is happening. So for instance, when all of this was formulated and when Ayurveda first came out, it was many thousands of years ago where there were no instrumentation and there was no imaging and there was no way for us to see what was happening inside. However, we used inference. We used our intellect to understand if we have an effect, then the cause may be in this certain manner. So for instance, if you have different qualities or different consistencies or different frequency of elimination of waste, that indicates what is happening at the upper stages or the earlier stages of digestion, because this is the last stage of digestion, okay? So by looking at or understanding the different variances or different qualities of someone's poop, it gives us a very clear idea as to how healthy or lack thereof their digestive tract is working. Just like a machine, you put something in, it has to process that, and whatever the output is, the quality of the output indicates the quality of the process and also the quality of what was put in the first place. Okay? So the Apanavata is that which is responsible for not only holding in the waste in the colon for the proper amount of time, but also for initiation of elimination of that waste. So this is looking at for the elimination of fecal matter, but it's also responsible for initiation of the urge of passing urine, for, again, expulsion of semen, for expulsion of menstruation. It initiates all of these functions or all of these movement. Again, here, if you notice, all of these things are moving out of the body. Even though they are physical matter or they are waste products, they all need to move out of the body. And that movement, or that being able to push it out of the body, is done by the Apanavata. So therefore, the gati or the flow of Apanavata is downwards. The last type of vata or subdosha vata is Vyanavata, and that is located in the heart or the entire body, because it actually circulates all throughout the whole body. So its main function is cardiac function and circulation of blood and lymph, and also responsible for movement such as walking and all other movements, because that requires movement of the whole body. Okay, so the Vyanavata is responsible for a type of flow or movement that circulates throughout the whole body, or movement of the whole body. Okay, and so therefore the gati or flow of that is circular or throughout the entire body. So this is, again, just looking at the subdoshas and the functions and the location of it. But that is looking at the normal functions of these doshas, okay? So far, do you guys have any questions? I know this is a lot of information to take in all at once. Okay, well, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we can talk about this, or we can discuss this. And this chart, or this table, is also there in your manual. So you can always feel free to refer back to what this information that you already have. Okay? So looking at next, this is looking at just the normal functions of these different types of subdoshas. But when there is an abnormality, or when there is a change in the qualities of vata, or the quantity of vata, or even the function of vata, as you can look at here in the function of any one of these types of vatas, then it causes an imbalance. And those different types of imbalances have been described in the classical texts. So for instance, the imbalance of pranavata, some of the common disorders that we notice are hiccup, cough, bronchitis, asthma, cold, and sometimes, in this case, a hoarse voice. So hoarse voice here only because of the movement or the flow of vata can affect the person's voice as well. Okay, so here again, looking specifically at the conditions that they've enumerated in the classical text, we know that even asthma is actually nothing but an issue with the prana vata. Okay? The emotional symptoms. So remember, prana vata is also responsible for intelligence and for controlling thoughts. So therefore, it may also produce symptoms psychologically, such as anxiety, nervousness, fear, bewilderment, and delirium. And that's, again, that happens when vata tends to move too quickly. So the one quality to remember about vata is it's constantly moving. Vata never stops. Vata always needs to be moving. Whenever there is something that blocks the movement of vata, that causes an imbalance. And when vata moves too much in a certain direction. And what do I mean by moving too much? I mean, for instance, it's flowing out too quickly. Because in any type of movement or flow, there needs to be a regulated manner. Okay? Here, let me see what the question is. So what do the numbers? The numbers 3, 1, and 3 in this chart was actually, originally when we had done the chart, we were putting in references. And so these are references from the classical text and from the shlokas that you have in the last chapter in your text, in your manual. So we were actually putting in the references in the chapter itself, but it became too overwhelming and we didn't want it to be too confusing. So instead we put all of the classical references in one chapter instead of actually inserting it into each one of these chapters. So originally when we had it, that was what with the 1 and 3 was. It was in the footnotes, the Sanskrit and the classical reference. But thank you for asking that question. Okay. So in looking at, again, vata needs to constantly be moving. So for instance, an example of this, you ever notice if someone hyperventilates, or if someone is really, really angry, or if there's something that's agitated, or even in the case of anxiety, how the person breathes? When there is anxiety or nervousness or fear or even anger, in all these conditions, their breathing tends to be very shallow and very quick, and they end up hyperventilating. They breathe instead of a normal flow of a deep inhale and a deep exhale. So that what that is the excessive movement of vata. Vata needs to be moving. The prana needs to move. You need to inhale and exhale at all times. However, there is a certain pace and rhythm to that breathing. There is a certain pace and rhythm to the movement of vata. And that's what's important to always remember, is that you can't stop vata from moving, because if you stop, for instance, if you stop breathing, that wouldn't be very good either. But you want to breathe, you want to be able to have that exchange or that movement, that flow of vata, but it needs to be at a specific pace and rhythm, as opposed to being either too much or too less. Okay? So that's what we mean by vata moving out too quickly, or vata not moving at all. In both of those conditions, you end up with imbalance of vata, and you end up with different types of vata-related ailments. Okay? So in the condition, emotional symptoms such as anxiety, nervousness, and fear, and bewilderment, and delirium, in all those conditions, vata is moving out too quickly. It's moving too excessively, as opposed to in its regulated manner. This is also the reason why you notice if someone is feeling this way and their breathing is so erratic, what is the first thing someone tells them to do? Why don't you just take a deep breath? Just take a deep breath. And the reason why they tell you to take a deep breath is because if you take a deep breath, then that actually helps to calm you down, because the emotions that are being exhibited at that time is also regulated and responsible because of the Pranavata. Okay, so just by being able to regulate the flow of the Pranavata, you are also able to regulate the emotions that is attributed to the Pranavata. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is looking at the common disorders and the emotional symptoms. There are also pathological conditions or disease manifestations that are associated with the Pranavata. So an example of that is stroke or paralysis, different types of epilepsy, sleep apnea, and tremors of Parkinson's. All of these are disease conditions or pathologies because of a aggravation or an irregularity of the Pranavata. Okay? Similarly, in Udanavata, there are also common disorders that are associated with the deviation from the normal flow of the Udanavata. So here also you have the common disorders such as hoarseness of voice, stuttering, blushing and flushing. So in that, it's because again, if it's excessive movement of the Udanavata moving upwards. The hoarseness of voice, of course, because there's not clear movement of the Udanavata upwards. And stuttering, again, because something is either blocking or hindering the proper flow of the Udanavata upwards. Okay? The emotional symptoms that are associated with Udanavata are the imbalance of Udanavata are lack of memory, lack of goals and direction, or lack of goals and direction. Okay? And that again is because memory and enthusiasm is a normal function of Udanavata. Therefore, if Udanavata is impaired, it will cause lack of memory and lack of goals, because there will be no enthusiasm. And therefore, the disease manifestation of the pathologies that are associated with that are asthma, pneumonia, and emphysema. So is this starting to make a little bit of sense now? Hopefully you're able to, I know this is, again, a lot of information. However, when you start to get more used to looking at the different functions of Vata, being more aware of how these different doshas work in the body, then you can see the concept of how Ayurveda looks at the proper or normal functioning of the body, and therefore a deviation from that function that gives us an idea about different pathologies. This is the reason why in Ayurveda, though we may not necessarily have a name for many different disease conditions, there are lots of disease conditions that are now recently being discovered or being named. The reason why we still look at them in Ayurveda is because they're always, again, traced back to the doshas. And you can even trace it back to the sub-doshas or the different functions that are being deviated due to a specific causative factor. And the causative factor is nothing but the diet and lifestyle that has caused a vitiation or an aggravation of that dosha. Okay, so whether we have a name for the condition or we don't, if something exists within the body, then it clearly has some representation or some change that has happened in the equilibrium of the doshas. Okay, so let me look at, there's a question here. What is the difference between common disorders and disease manifestation? And why is asthma in the disorders on Pranavata and a disease in Udanavata? So this actually is a description. Why is asthma common disorders and a disease? Okay. The reason why, that's a great question. The reason why asthma is in disorders in Pranavata and it is a disease, a common disorder in Pranavata and a disease in Udanavata, is because the English translations that we've put here are actually a translation of the Sanskrit term. So the Sanskrit term for asthma here actually means shwasa. And when we look at the context and where we use the term shwasa, it represents different presentations of shwasa. So for instance, shwasa in the common disorders means breathing difficulty, whereas shwasa in the disease manifestation actually means that type of asthma. If we were to really use the term, both are considered like different types of asthma. Asthma is also a breathing difficulty. However, breathing difficulty can also be a symptom and not necessarily a disease. So that's why when we look at it in a common disorder of pranavata, we're looking at it as a symptom, as a very mild sign and symptom. Whereas when we're looking at it in udanavata, it is actually the same sort of condition, but as an actual disease instead of just a symptom. And again, this is a great question because you've basically just opened the door to talk about the different stages of pathology. Because according to the different stages of pathology, we look at, you have the same representation and the same manifestation, but the intensity of the symptoms will be different. So for instance, you have in the same condition or the same example of shwasa or asthma. Asthma, the cardinal sign and symptom of asthma is breathing difficulty. So from the time it starts, the person has an issue with breathing. However, that intensity or the difficulty of breathing becomes worse as it becomes more and more chronic and as it becomes worse. I just want to take a quick minute to ask you all, if you haven't been able to mute your microphones, could you please mute your microphones so that we won't have so much of residual sound? Thank you. Great. So this is the reason why both of those terms are used. And yes, I know we've used the English translation, but this is also the reason why there is a lot of depth to be able to use the Sanskrit terms or learn the Sanskrit terms. Because in one term, there is a whole depth of meaning. And depending on the context of using that same term in different manners, it represents a different meaning and it represents a whole other depth of information. Okay? I hope that partially answered your question. I know that's a bit of a complicated answer, but if we were, when we get into it more, and if we get to some time to talk about the different stages of pathology or the different stages of how the doshas start to get aggravated and how they start to produce a change in the body and start to exhibit different signs and symptoms and intensity of signs and symptoms, then that's where we would be able to understand the difference between a common disorder, which is just like a mild sign and symptom, as opposed to it becoming a disease manifestation where it's it has progressed to become an actual disease. Okay? Is that clear? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the disease manifestation for udanavata is asthma, pneumonia, and emphysema. So the next is samanavata. So now looking at the functions of the samanavata, again, the common disorders, because samanavata is responsible for initiating or igniting the agni, the common disorders associated with imbalance of samanavata is loss of appetite, indigestion, increased or decreased peristalsis, bloating, and lack of absorption. Okay, and that's the reason why is because you would think, what does that have to do with increased or decreased peristalsis? Because again, the samanavata is responsible for igniting the agni, for maintaining the strength of the agni or the strength of your appetite, basically. And according to your appetite, according to your digestive capacity, that's what determines how long the food stays in your stomach or how quickly it moves out. If your digestive capacity is very strong, it keeps the food in the stomach for the appropriate amount of time because it needs to break it down, and it is strong enough to be able to do that work and break down the food. However, If it is not strong, it cannot break down the food and does not keep it in the stomach for the appropriate amount of time. And therefore, what happens is it can only break down to a certain extent, and then it allows the half undigested food to move on to the other parts of the digestive tract, and therefore it ends up moving down faster than it should. And therefore, that is when it happens as increased peristalsis, which is basically very similar to the root cause of irritable bowel syndrome, where a person is, where there is a frequent elimination of stools, because again, that is really dependent on the strength of the Agni, which really helps in the Samanavata, which initiates that, okay? And also for bloating and lack of absorption. The disease manifestation for changes or imbalances in the Samanavata are here also asthma, pneumonia, and emphysema. And the reason why, again here, is because you would think, what does that have anything to do with the stomach, and what does that have anything to do with igniting the Agni? These don't seem to really have any relation. The reason why it is still true here as well is because asthma and pneumonia and emphysema are also conditions that really start the root cause for those are actually at the stomach. That happens because the Samanavata, Apanavata, Prana, and Udanavata are actually, again, one and the same Vata. So when there is an abnormality in the flow of Vata, especially, again, here in the abnormality in the flow of the Samanavata, that starts to affect the flow of the other Vatas as well. So, for instance, if a person is constipated, there is a problem with the Apanavata because that's responsible for elimination of fecal matter. So what happens is there's an actual block. Something is blocking. The fecal matter is sitting there in the colon, not moving out. The Apanavata is also not moving out. So what happens? It starts to move in the opposite direction because at the end of the day, Vata needs to move. If you don't allow it to move in the direction it wants to, it's going to find a different way to move. So what happens is it starts to move upwards. Similarly, what it'll do is it'll start to aggravate the Samanavata because as it moves upward, it affects the next closest Vata or the next closest flow of Vata, and that's the Samanavata. So it affects the Samanavata. There will be an irregularity in the digestive capacity and the expression of appetite. Similarly, it'll keep going up. It'll start to affect again the Udanavata and also the Pranavata, because those both are located in a very similar, or in a similar place, in a very close entity. So it affects both. That's why even in cases we always find that most people who have issues with breathing problems or different aspects or different presentations of asthma, they almost always have this issue with either gas or bloating or constipation, that either they've had it for a very long time or they had it and it's gone away, or they currently have it and it's very chronic. But that almost always indicates, because it's basically indicating the change and the aggravation of the flow of all the types of Vata. Okay? Does that make sense? We will talk about it even more in the class, but I just wanted to give you an idea as to how they are all related to each other. And by aggravation of one, it can absolutely lead to aggravation of all of them. Okay? And that goes for all the different types of the subdoshas of Pitta and the subdoshas of Kapha as well. So the next is Apanavata. So for instance, we know that Apanavata is responsible again for initiation and elimination of all of the different waste products in the downward movement. So fecal matter, urine, semen, menstruation, and the fetus. And in that, if there is an imbalance of this Apanavata, the common disorders are, of course, delayed labor, infertility, fat accumulation in thighs, because what that is again, it's not proper elimination in the nearest orifice, so it starts to accumulate in the thighs. also because that is one of the regions for Vata as well. Amenorrhea is a condition where there is delayed menstruation, or there is, for instance, there isn't proper menstruation. It's not happening every month. It happens sometimes once in 2 months, once in 3 months, or even once in 6 months. That is a condition known as amenorrhea. Also, similarly, if the Apana Vata is moving out too much, then there may be heavy menstruation, or pain during menstruation, or even pain during intercourse, which is, again, it is a block or an abnormal flow of the Apana Vata downwards. Pain in the lower back, that's because Vata is getting stuck and not moving downwards, so it starts to circulate and move in the same area, and so therefore it causes pain in the lower back, and also premature ejaculation. So now, again, looking at the function of the movement and the actual function of Apana Vata, now we can understand that if there is an imbalance in the Apana Vata, why these sort of disorders may manifest. And the disease manifestation and actual disease condition, the terminology here is osteoporosis. Okay. The last one is Vyana Vata, which is that, again, which circulates throughout the body. So the common disorders or due to imbalance of Vyana Vata is, of course, poor circulation, ischemia, fever, diarrhea, and edema. Okay. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information that we have gone through today. Again, I'll open up. Do you guys have any questions so far? Either it's very clear or it's extremely confusing. Okay. So if no questions so far, then I will move forward to be able to go through some of Pitta. Of course, we have only a few minutes left, but at least I'll talk to you about the functions of Pitta and looking at the functions of Pitta and one of the different subdoshas of Pitta. Okay. So here are, so Pitta, as we know, is the dosha that is representation of fire and water. So if you look at these, fire and water seems contradictory to each other. How can they possibly exist together? But Pitta has a small amount of water content in it. And the water content of Pitta is a liquid form, however, a liquid form that still has the fire qualities in it. So an example of this is, for instance, digestive enzymes. Digestive enzymes are secreted in a fluid form. However, they still have the capacity for digestion. They still have the capacity for initiating metabolism and breakdown and transformation. So therefore, it is a fluid. However, it's still a fluid that has the same qualities or properties of the fire element. Okay, so that's why Pitta has fluids, but even those fluids are still hot in nature. Okay, so therefore the qualities associated with the Pitta dosha, which is representation of the fire and water elements, it is sasneha, which means it's slightly unctuous or slightly moist. Okay, tikshna, which means it's very penetrating, ushna, which is hot, laghu, which is light, visram, which is it has a strong odor, sara, which means it's free flowing, and drava, which is the fluidity. So you get the visram, sara, and drava because of the combination of the fire and water elements. You get the laghu, ushna, or the hot, light, and tikshna, or penetrating, predominantly because of the fire element qualities. And the sasneha, or the slightly unctuous, is due to the water component of the Pitta. So that's how you end up with these qualities associated with the Pitta dosha. Okay? So in looking at that, now we know that there are 5 types or 5 subdoshas of Pitta. So the 5 subdoshas of Pitta are Pachaka Pitta, Ranjaka Pitta, Sadhaka Pitta, Alochaka Pitta, and Rajaka Pitta. Okay? And remember, one of the major functions or the most important quality of Pitta is the fact that it is responsible for metabolism and transformation. So Vata is responsible for movement and initiation. Pitta is responsible for metabolism and for transformation, from transforming from one substance or one thing to another. And in order to be able to do that, that happens because of the Pitta dosha. So anything in the body that, or anytime there is any form of transformation, whether it be a good transformation or a bad transformation, that is all done by Pitta. So what do I mean by a bad transformation? An example of a bad transformation is, for instance, when something becomes putrefied, or for instance, when there is an infection and there is pus formation. That is, again, it's something that is transforming from one state to another, and that is nothing that is done by, again, the Pitta dosha. Okay, so the major function for Pitta is transformation or metabolism, breakdown. And of the sub-doshas of Pitta, the most important of them is the Pachaka Pitta. So the Pachaka Pitta is that which is located in the stomach or the small intestine, and its function is digestion, absorption, and assimilation of food. And that's because it is located, in the stomach, and it's basically a representation of the digestive enzymes and the actual hydrochloric acid that is secreted into the stomach. That is nothing but the Pachaka Pitta. So it's important here to remember that there is a difference between Pachaka Pitta and Agni. Remember, we described briefly about what Agni is, the Jatra Agni, the fire that is responsible for digestion. So here also there is a fire, and Pitta also there is a fire. But there is a difference between Pachaka Pitta and Agni. And the main difference between both of these is Pitta has the water element in it, whereas the Jatra Agni is a separate entity that is purely fire alone. So though they have similar qualities, the Jatra Agni is also fire, and Pitta is also the fire element. However, the difference is that Pachaka Pitta is in a liquid form. It also has the presence of the water element, whereas the Jatra Agni is purely just the fire element alone. Okay, so it's really important not to mistake these two. The Pachaka Pitta is not the Jatra Agni, and the Agni is not the Pachaka Pitta. They are very similar, they have similar functions, however, they are two actual separate entities. Okay, so in looking at that, the Pachaka Pitta, or if we look at the digestive enzymes in the stomach, with the representation of that, or the presence of that, we're actually able to break down your food. Okay, I'm going to stop there with the different sub-doshas, and we'll pick up from Ranjaka Pitta onwards and finish up the rest of the sub-doshas in our next class. Again, if you have any questions, or I know this again is a lot of information, don't feel too overwhelmed or feel bad if you don't understand it, because it takes a while to be able to mentally digest this material. Nobody understands it in the first go. So don't worry about it. Just keep it there in the back of your head. Luckily this video is recorded, so you can keep watching it over and over again. And it helps when you're able to hear it, because hearing the terms and hearing this a couple of times then really helps to sort of solidify the concept of it in your mind. So don't worry if it seems a bit confusing right now. Take a little break and then go back to it whenever you have some time, and then read through it again. And the more you read through this, the more it's going to start to make sense, and it's going to start to come together. An easy way to be able to learn the doshas and understand the doshas is to try to be aware of the doshas in your body. That is the best way to learn about the doshas. Okay? Okay.
Thanks, Anusha.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording, and the students will see you next week.
Absolutely.
Okay, good night, everyone.